Why the American dream is dead. Dead in the water. Let's see. This is going to upset a lot of people and probably create some, juicy takes.
Dream is dying. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. As a result, for one of the first times in history, you're more likely to achieve the American dream outside of the US. The idea that you can begin with nothing and through hard work and dedication still achieve success has been a fundamental principle in the US for centuries. Some of the earliest immigrants came to this country with that goal in mind and ended up creating things we still use today: Levi jeans, AT&T, and Colgate toothpaste. For centuries, most Americans achieved financial success by earning more than their parents, allowing their family to climb the economic ladder. The idea was if you did well in school, went to college, worked hard, and saved, you would be financially better off than your previous generation. But nowadays, that might not be true anymore. Rates of upward mobility has fallen drastically over the past few decades. While 90% of children born in the 1940s earned more than their parents, only 50% of children born in
Percent of children earning more than their parents by year of birth. So what we got? Year of the child, and then earning income more than their parents. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. I don't find this too surprising though, to be honest.
In the 1980s earned more. But I'm sure you can name a couple of people who recently came from nothing and ended up doing really well. Howard Schultz, Oprah Winfrey, Ralph Lauren. Even for me, I never grew up with money, but after years of grinding, I'd say I'm doing pretty well for myself. And you might be quick to point out that this proves
Listen. Guy's name is Vincent Chan right here. He's sitting at 599,000 subscribers. This video alone has 215,000 views. I think Vincent's doing A-okay.
the American dream is alive and well. But when I'm talking about the American dream and economic mobility overall, I'm talking about the millions of Americans out there, not just the outliers. George Carlin says it's called the American.
This is smart to admit because a lot of people think with the way that modern media is that it is still possible, which it's not to say that's not possible, but it gets publicized and blown up a lot more. So everybody thinks that they can do it, putting in a minimalistic amount of work.
Dream because you'd have to be asleep to believe it. But first, as a kid, I never imagined that I'd be where I am today, traveling the world, running my own businesses, and doing what I love. And it all started with this educational YouTube channel that allowed me to quit my job. If you want to learn the exact strategies I use to start and grow my educational YouTube channel and build multiple businesses,
here comes the plug.
Join my free Facebook group.
There it is.
Business Accelerator.
Good stuff.
Link below. One of the most interesting things I discovered is
that was a good plug, Dad. Though that ad actually makes sense. That was good.
You're more likely to achieve the American dream outside of the US for one reason. In socioeconomics, they call this intergenerational persistence of poverty. Basically, individuals who grow up in poverty are more likely to remain in poverty as adults.
Of course.
And this cycle can continue for generations.
I mean,
Professor Zachary Parolin knows a thing or two.
I mean, this is the definition of so many, people in our major cities, right? Like, so many of them, their family, their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, like, they've all just had to live a tough life in a really bad area. And for a lot of them, it is not as simple as just get out and leave. Like that's not an option. So, I mean, it's a lot easier. Let's just say this. It's a lot easier for somebody to stay poor than it is for actually somebody to stay rich. Because usually if you're raised rich and have no idea how to manage money, there's no way your next line of generation will actually have any kind of wealth left from you.
About this. In 2023, Parolin and his team discovered that if a child grew up in poverty in the US, they have a 42% higher chance of experiencing poverty as an adult. But what blew my mind is that the intergenerational persistence of poverty rate in Denmark and Germany is a quarter, 1/4 of that of the US. And it's not just those two countries either. There's also Australia and the UK.
Okay, so it's 4 times stronger than in Denmark and in Germany, and twice as strong as Australia and UK. I mean, that makes sense. So I guess we need to get to the root of the problem is how do you get these people that are already poor to not be poor anymore?
Okay. This finding, along with many other related studies, have come to the conclusion that upward mobility and economic success is kind of like a relay race where you pass batons to future generations. Depending on your family's economic background, you start at a different position from other teams on the racetrack. If your family is in the bottom 20% of earners, you'll be all the way in the back. If your family is in the top percent of earners, you'll be in the front. Once the starting pistol goes off, everyone runs. If you can't run as fast as the other teams, or if you start further away, you'll pass the baton to your kids later in the race. With each new generation, the baton gets passed to a new person. Your kid will pass it to your grandkids, and so on. Over time, if nothing changes, the gap between your family and the other teams will widen and become increasingly difficult to close. The ability to close this gap is what achieving the American dream is all about. And studies found
This is why when they sit there and tell people to save money, like, it's become such just a generic statement, and so many people when they're in their young and early days don't worry about saving money because they're not looking at bigger picture. So when you set yourself up financially for a very tough situation in your 20s and then even going into your 30s, that's why when they were talking about those numbers of still being in poverty when the average age was 25 to 35 is because now it's a lot harder to come back from that. You kind of still do get a fresh start regardless of even when you're living in poverty. It as a chance in society, barring some wild thing. But when you've already then let some of those things take over into early adulthood, you're kind of digging your grave even deeper than it kind of already was.
found that people are twice as likely to close it in Denmark than in the United States. But when and how did this happen? To understand how we got here, we need to take a step back to the 1960s. In the 1960s, advances in computer
Oh yeah, boys, back in the day when life was simpler.
technology, greater access to international trade, and a growing workforce lifted a significant number of people out of poverty. In 1971, 61% of adults belonged to the middle class and did
Holy hell! So yeah, this is crazy. This definitely I don't really have much to say about this because it's so accurate. I love looking at data and trying to tell you like, oh, that this could be skewed because of this, but I mean I feel like this is so spot on right there. And I mean, you guys can tell me if you're wrong, or if I'm wrong, please.
middle class things, going to Disney World, drinking at Starbucks, and drawing on Etch-a-Sketches. But by 2021, that number fell to 50%. The proportion of each future generation belonging to the middle class continued to shrink. When baby boomers were in their 20s, 59% of them were middle class. When
So 59 were middle class. Gen X, millennial. Wow, that's insane. It's just I think this also comes down to more and more entertainment things, and more things to be able to spend money on became more and more prevalent the more that you get to, technology wise. Like if you look at from a social or entertainment things to do in 1983, 2002 versus what there was to do socially and just for entertainment in 1942 and 1965, there's obviously a lot more things to do in this day and age, and then obviously even in those years, than there was back then. And it's also become a lot more mainstream to do those things.
millennials were in their 20s, that number dropped to 53%. And sure, some of the lucky few moved into the upper class, but for the majority of Americans, most were either stuck or moving down. And this is only getting worse. When it comes to wealth and
Oh shit, you bring up these inflation rates, man, it ain't gonna get any better.
financial success, the first thing people think about is income. How much did you make this year? Wait, did I make more last year? From 1970 to 2020, the middle class median income jumped 50% from $59,934 to $90,131.
Can you believe that? Like, I know if people watch this video and it's outside the US, like, you might not be able to, like, fully comprehend. But, like, that $90,000 being considered middle class is insane. Like, growing up, this is, and again, this was as a young, stupid kid, right? Even, and not even understanding the value of money. If somebody asked me when I was 13, 14, what did I consider middle class? It was about this number. Honestly, like, this is what I thought. I remember my parents asking me, like, my dad sent something to me, like, one day, like, what class do you think we are? And I was like, oh, I don't know, middle class. I didn't know exactly what he made, but I was like, probably somewhere in that ballpark. He was like, yeah, like, I'd consider that middle. This $90,000 being considered middle class is insane. But it's accurate. It's true.
2020 dollars. On the other hand, the upper class saw their median income jump by 69% and the lower class 45%. Although paychecks are substantially bigger than 40 years ago, the reality is real average income barely budged since 1978. In economics, real average income is how much you earn after accounting for inflation. Basically, if you make $40,000 per year, and last year you bought groceries for a month for $200 with that income, but this year, if your income remains at $40,000, but groceries now cost $220, your real income has worsened because you can't buy as many groceries with the same amount of money.
That makes sense.
When it comes to a business, how much revenue it can generate depends on how productive their employees are. The more productive, the more revenue the company can earn. Since the 1940s, overall productivity has gone.
And nowadays, everybody feels overworked and underpaid, so why would they be as productive at work than they would be if they were fairly paid? Now, whether they actually are, that's a different conversation, but so many people, genuine good workers, not the bitch, oh, I just don't want to work, the actual good workers out there, a lot of them really are still overworked and underpaid. It's crazy.
Gone up, and as expected, so has revenue. The problem is, most of the increased revenue has been going into the pockets of executives rather than the workers. In the 1970s, a CEO earned 20 times more than their typical worker. Nowadays, a CEO makes 296 times more.
This is insane. And do you want to know how these CEOs structured it this way to get away with this kind of stuff? It's because now it's all bonus incentives. Right, I'm not gonna go listing any names here, but the company that I used to work for, we one time looked up what our CEO's salary was. We saw what the salary was, and we said, "Wow, that's actually not as crazy." It was, I literally want to say it was probably like $500,000, $600,000, and it's like, okay, as a CEO of a company, like even me as the little worker, I can look at that and say that that's okay. But then we saw that they racked in $12 million in bonuses. $12 million in bonuses. That is absolutely insane. But they just sit there and say like, oh, it's just the salary. But all they're doing is taking direct profit and splitting it amongst the top heavy and not doing anything for the little guys. It's ridiculous.
And we see this disparity across the board. Since 1979, real annual wage increases grew by only 15% for the bottom 90%, but it grew by 138% for the top 1%. But income isn't the only factor when it comes to wealth. In economics, one way to measure expenses is with the cost of thriving index. Basically, this index shows how many days a typical worker would need to work in a given year to earn enough income to cover the major expenses for a family of four: food, housing, healthcare, transportation, and education. In 1984, the average major expenses for a family of four was around $13,227.
So is that, if they're doing that on a year basis, $13,000 in 1984? Hold on, I'm just trying to think. I want to kind of take a guess here before this actually comes. 1984, 13. God, I'm gonna look like an idiot. I feel like with no matter what I say, I feel like I'm gonna overshoot or undershoot just dramatically. I mean, if I had to ballpark here in today's day and age, I'd probably say, and this is a family of four, dude. Oh boy, I literally want to say like in the 40s, maybe 50s. I could see. I wouldn't be surprised if it's higher.
Typical male worker needed to work about 30 weeks to cover this cost. But in 2018, the average major living expense is now $54,000.
Oh, let's go, baby. That's actually crazy. It totally checks out though. When that's on a 30-week salary, let's see what this would have to be.
$441, and the typical male worker has to work 53 weeks to cover this cost. And
that's insane.
In case you didn't know, there are only 52 weeks.
I wanted to say something, but I didn't want to sound like an idiot. So I'm glad he's breaking this down.
In an entire year. The reality is, the typical worker isn't even living paycheck to paycheck anymore. They're actually doing worse. But there's one thing more important than income.
True, almost. There are so many people, I mean, that I know that are just, they're still paying off credit cards that from things that they bought years ago strictly off of the interest. Not even things like, you know, a house or a car. They're just credit card, like things from forever ago. Like they're still paying on because of interest. I mean, I feel like that's probably another big thing that they might hit on here. It's, I mean, interest rates have just become so common now on almost everything.
Income and expenses, and that's a share of aggregate income. Basically, who holds the greatest percentage of income in the US? In the 1970s, the middle class, which contained over 60% of the population, owned the majority of the nation's wealth. This makes sense since most people in the country were middle class, and this continued to be true until 2008, when everything changed. During the 2008 Great Recession, financial markets crashed and millions lost their savings, jobs, and homes. This was the final blow that eroded middle and lower class wealth to this day. The widening income gap and shrinking middle class allowed the upper class to slowly capture more and more of the aggregate income in the US. In the 1970s, they owned just 29% of the aggregate income. In 2020, that number nearly doubled to 50%. Today, the wealth gap between the upper class and middle class families is at the highest level ever recorded. When it comes to the American dream, meritocracy is deeply ingrained into its core ethos. The idea is, as long as you're determined and a hard worker, you'll become successful regardless if you come from wealth or not. All you gotta do is study hard, get good grades.
And to a certain extent, I do still agree with this. If you truly say that, oh, no, there was nothing I could have done different and I'm in the situation that I'm in, I think you're wrong. You can almost always look back to situations where you made the wrong mistake or, you thought you were doing the right thing, but you weren't. And that's okay. I mean, that's everybody does it. Everybody, even the richest people. I'm sure you could look at Elon Musk, and if you told him, hey, what things would you go change? He would probably do 1,000 things different. Like, that's just how it is. But unfortunately, when you're just put into those positions so early on, it makes those times that you maybe made one mistake, it makes it a lot more significant because you're already in such a tough situation.
Go to a top university, and graduate with a lucrative job offer. While this sounds good in theory, the problem is it doesn't work in practice. Our systems are filled with corruption, nepotistic favoritism, and insular power hierarchies that prevent a true meritocracy from happening. Economist Raj Chetty knows a thing or two about this topic. He and his team discovered that top universities like Harvard, Caltech, and NYU give preferences to children of alumni and students at private schools. As a result, these top universities admit children of America's wealthiest families 77 times more compared to the bottom 20.
Yeah, that's insane. I think that's absolutely insane that our college system now has become more of a money thing. You're more likely to get into a good college with bad grades if your parents make a lot of money than the guy who had good grades but comes from being a poor family. I think this is absolutely true, and I think it's ridiculous.
20%. Oh, and don't even get me started on how wealthy parents straight up bought spots for their children at top universities. And it's not just the education system, the job market does something similar.
Money talks a lot more now, I feel like, than it used to. People play sports, people get into things that they shouldn't, all because they necessarily have money and they can kind of pay their way through. I mean, look at the world that we're in, the gaming world, right? There are so many people that are just dominant at their game because they spent shit tons of money. There's not necessarily anything wrong with it, but where do you kind of draw the line?
Consider this study by Matthew Steger, who found that companies don't always hire the most qualified candidates. Often,
well, of course not. They're going to take whoever's at least qualified but will work for the least amount of money compared to the competition at hand. Why would you pay two people with almost the same skill set, but this guy went to work and has a degree and has a certification for it, and he wants $130,000 when you can pay this guy $70,000 because he's desperate and that's the only thing that he can do? From a business perspective, you're an idiot if you don't take the guy that's $70,000. You just don't.
Sometimes they hire an existing employee's child, and those Nepo kids earn almost 20% more than they would otherwise. The problem is, the more you believe the American dream and meritocratic systems are absolutes, the more you'll blame yourself for a broken system. If you don't get into your dream college, you think, it's my fault for not being smart enough. If you don't get your dream job, you think...
And that's what people need to just kind of get over. And if you have a whole bunch of good grades and you didn't get into the school, and you know deep down that it's because your family comes from not having as much money, fuck them. Who cares? Fuck that school. What does their opinion of what you are capable of matter? But nowadays, like, people just take it too personal and they beat themselves up for it. And I get it, but who cares? Who cares what somebody thinks? There's plenty of, like, people just have this dream of, oh, I need to go to this school to make this happen. And it's not true. in almost all cases, it's almost not true. It is true for the few. There are few niches.
I'm not good enough. I can never be good enough. When in reality, the top of America's meritocratic ladder is surrounded by a barbed wire fence, guard dogs, and a frat dude asking, "Who do you know here?" The American dream, once a core fixture of our country,
That's so true. We care way too much about like social economic status now. It's not even necessarily how much money you have. It's just, oh, if you know the most people, you're important now.
is dying. The good news, it might not be completely gone. After some research, I discovered that it's a tale of two cities. There are still some small pockets of opportunities sprinkled throughout the country. Places like California and Utah have an upward mobility rate of around 15%, which is more than the US national average and even higher than Denmark. On the other hand, places like Georgia,
I'm actually really so California does not surprise me, right? Because California is where I would actually say vast majority of like tech companies, right? They're usually either over in California, and then some hold down New York and whatnot. But I mean, California, I'm actually very surprised that Utah is on this list. I'm really surprised by that. I guess it does make sense. So it's probably a really up and coming state.
have a rate less than 4.8%. Surprisingly, the differences go even deeper.
And then do you know actually what's crazy right here? I'm not surprised by this, and I'm not surprised that these are so much darker, because do you know what the South really goes like heavy on? And again, not necessarily saying that there's anything wrong with this, but this is just what happens. They are huge on family. They are huge on family, specifically in this area right here. Let's go. They're so big on family, so yes, they're going to be the ones that are a lot more likely to sit there and get their cousin hired to make more money. This totally makes sense.
8%. Surprisingly, the differences go even deeper. You're 2 times more likely to move up economically in San Francisco than in Oakland, 2 cities that are only 30 minutes away from each other. In 1994, the US Department of Housing ran an experiment with over 4,500 participants. They provided thousands of low-income families living in a bad neighborhood a chance to live in a better one. 16 years later, they evaluated the effects of this move. And the result? Kids who were under 13 when they moved were 27% more likely to go to college and had a 30% higher income compared to the control group. This finding, along with follow-up studies to back it, have identified 2 reasons for the differences. First, in the US, school systems are funded using property taxes. Naturally,
true. This is what causes a whole lot of problems, because when you live in a place where property taxes aren't necessarily as high, right? Your schools are genuinely shittier.
In the US, school systems are funded using property taxes.
That's why, for example, the place that we live, we bought a house at a very good price, but it's a very up-and-coming area, so our property taxes go up every single year ridiculously because the public schools are shit. Almost nobody in where we live will send their kid to our public school. They have to pay for some kind of other private school, and it makes total sense.
Naturally, the amount in property taxes depend on the value of the surrounding properties. Typically, more expensive neighborhoods lead to more cash flowing to the local school systems. So while some schools can afford smart boards, gourmet lunches, and valet parking, others struggle to pay for air conditioning.
Man, some of them there's probably schools out there that still have the TV cart coming across the tray. Oh my God. I bet. And this doesn't surprise me here. Classes resume in sweltering heat with no AC. I'm not surprised. There's plenty of workplaces out there that don't have AC in the summer. Oh well. This doesn't surprise me at all.
Conditioning in 100-degree weather. Next, social capital. In economics, they call it the bowling alley theory. Basically, they found that areas with more organized bowling leagues.
Oh, dude, I wanted that. That looked like a good ball.
And teams have higher levels of upward mobility. The idea is having bowling teams implies a higher level of social engagement, stronger bonds, and networks that help the community at large. We've been sold the American dream for decades. Work hard, go to college, follow the rules, and you'll do well. But that's no longer the case for most people. What was once a reality for many is now just a fading dream. Although it may be challenging to achieve financial success, it's not impossible. But you'll need to reinvent yourself and take action. And it all starts with this foundational change that you need to make. This video will explain how we're psychologically programmed from birth to be poor, and it's not your fault.
This was a good video. That was a really good idea. I actually saw this video sitting on the side, and I was gonna set it to save later. Maybe we'll probably get that on Tuesday. To upload YouTube on Wednesday. This was an amazing video. I think this was really good. I'm gonna probably see what other kind of stuff this guy has, and we'll probably keep reacting to it. Here's the link for this. Go like it. Like, sub, hook him up, hook him up. This is good content. Let's see. My biggest mistake was not buying real estate when I was 2 years old. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean the reason it's called dreams is because you have to be asleep for it to be real. True. You basically have to have side hustles just to live now. Just to live like how our parents' generation lived in a single based household income. This is true. Honestly, nowadays, if you're not sitting there with, you know, going in on multiple things outside of your other job, it's gonna be tough for you to make money. It's crazy. American dream's done.